I grew up believing silence was peaceful. It took me 32 years to understand that silence can also be a weapon. Our family home sat on the edge of a quiet American suburb, white siding, peeling paint, a front porch that creaked like it wanted to complain but never quite did. From the street, we looked like a good family, the kind neighbors waved at, the kind people trusted. Inside, we were experts at pretending. My father, Richard Hale, was a man who believed emotions were leaks in character. He spoke little, worked a lot, and carried disappointment the way other men carried keys, always within reach. My mother, Elaine, filled the house with noise to cover what he refused to say. Radios on, dishes clanking, television humming in empty rooms. And then there was my younger brother, Thomas. Thomas was the quiet one. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the kind that sits too long in a room and starts rearranging the furniture inside your chest. When we were kids, I talked for both of us. When Dad asked how school was, I answered. When Mom asked what we wanted for dinner, I decided. It wasn't control, it was survival. Someone had to keep the air moving. Thomas learned early that speaking didn't change outcomes, so he stopped. By the time we were adults, our roles were locked in place like furniture too heavy to move. Dad still avoided conflict by pretending it didn't exist. Mom still smoothed over cracks with forced smiles. And I, now living 2 states away, played the role of the successful son, the proof that nothing was wrong. Then, one autumn morning, the house called us back. My mother had suffered a stroke. Not fatal, not gentle either. Enough to blur her words and weaken one side of her body. Enough to bring us all home, standing awkwardly in hospital corridors that smelled like disinfectant and unsaid apologies. Thomas arrived before I did. He always did, even when no one noticed. When I walked into her room, Dad nodded once. Thomas stood by the window, hands in pockets, eyes fixed on a parking lot full of strangers coming and going, everyone leaving somewhere. I tried to fill the silence. I said, "She looks strong." No one answered. That night, we all returned to the old house. Same walls, same doors, same silence. Caring for Mom forced us together in ways we had avoided for years. Dad struggled with the tasks, feeding, helping her walk, because those required tenderness, and tenderness had never been his language. I handled logistics, bills, doctors, schedules. Thomas handled everything else. He cooked, he cleaned, he sat with Mom through the long afternoons when words failed her. He learned her new silences the way he had learned our old ones. I didn't notice right away. I was too busy being helpful in visible ways. One evening, I found Thomas sitting on the back porch, staring into the dark. "You okay?" I asked. He shrugged. That shrug held decades. A few nights later, I heard shouting. Real shouting, the kind that breaks through walls that have held for years. Dad's voice, sharp, controlled, dangerous. "You think I don't see it? You disappearing, not finishing anything, still the same?" Thomas's voice came back, quiet but steady. I stayed. Silence followed, the kind that makes your ears ring. I stepped into the hallway just as Dad stormed past me, face tight, jaw locked. Thomas stood alone in the kitchen, hands shaking. That was the first time I realized something had been building, slowly, silently, right under my success story. Later that night, Thomas finally spoke. "I gave up my job," he said, not looking at me. "For how long?" I asked. "Indefinitely." I started to protest, to tell him we'd figure something out, to talk. But then he looked at me, and I saw it. Years of being overlooked, years of absorbing tension meant for others, years of being the emotional buffer in a house that never learned how to speak honestly. "You left," he said. "You could. I stayed. Someone had to." That sentence landed harder than any argument, because he was right. The house had taught us roles, and we obeyed them without question. A week later, Dad collapsed in the living room, not from illness, but exhaustion. Sitting there, breathing hard, hands over his face, he looked smaller than I had ever seen him. That night, for the first time, he talked. Not well, not smoothly, but honestly. He talked about growing up with a father who believed love spoiled men, about learning to provide instead of connect, about being afraid that if he stopped holding everything together, it would all fall apart. And then Thomas spoke. He talked about feeling invisible, about learning that being quiet kept the peace but cost him his voice, about carrying everyone else's pain because no one asked if he had any of his own. I listened, really listened. For once, I didn't narrate, I didn't fix, I didn't fill the silence. I let it speak. Recovery was slow, not just for Mom, but for all of us. We didn't become perfect. We didn't suddenly turn into a warm, expressive family. But something shifted. We started naming things. When Dad withdrew, we said it. When Thomas needed help, he asked. When I felt the urge to escape, I stayed. Months later, as Mom walked unassisted for the first time in the living room, the house felt different. Same structure, new air. I learned something in that house. Some families bleed loudly, through shouting, chaos, visible scars. Others bleed quietly, through distance, avoidance, and unspoken expectations. Those wounds don't scream, they whisper, and if you don't listen, they shape entire lives. The lesson is this: silence doesn't mean peace. Sometimes it just means pain learned how to hide. And healing doesn't start when someone finally speaks. It starts when someone finally listens.